Everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, MAST Integrated Technology and Approach. I'm Patricia Garcia. I will be the webinar facilitator. Thank you for your engagement. We will be sure there are opportunities for you to be engaged, and as we saw in the screen, most of you are here looking for ideas of innovative technologies, and some of you have heard about MAST, and many of you have never heard about MAST. So that tells us that we are really on track about this webinar. This webinar will have opportunities for your interaction and will not be a passive viewing experience. In the chat pod in your lower right, please feel free to write your questions throughout the webinar. We will do the best to answer them throughout the webinar if we can, and at the end of the webinar, we will have a Q&A session. In terms of housekeeping, please be sure your microphone is mute, and we will use the chat box for your comments or questions. We won't have sound, and we all appreciate that if you require any technical assistance, you could write to Amrit. You will see him on the host box, Amrit Bandari, or to the Self Project address if you have any issues during the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and you will have a copy to share with your colleagues after we finish the webinar or during the Q&A session. Our speakers today, Euwema Bouvier from USAID and Jeff Euwema from the Lag Technology Solutions, and I'm your facilitator. So let me turn it to Euwema Bouvier from the USAID office.
Hi everyone, I'm Euwema Bouvier. I'm with USAID's Office of Land and Urban in the Bureau for Education, Energy and the Environment in Washington, D.C. And the Office of Land and Urban is the agency's central technical office for issues that are related to land tenure, property rights, and resources governance. The office work focuses on clarifying, documenting, and strengthening land tenure and property rights of individuals, businesses, and communities. This is a critical issue because securing property rights is a necessary condition for self-sustaining economic growth, women's economic empowerment, improved management of natural resources, reduced conflict, and good governance. Our office provides technical leadership to USAID and to US government worldwide on land tenure and property rights issues. Specifically, our office supports USAID's field missions in improving planning, programming, and decision-making through generating and disseminating evidence-based research, piloting and evaluating innovative technologies and approaches, and leveraging geospatial data and technology. We also collaborate with global partners, with other government agencies, US government agencies, with the private sector, and with the civil society to help shape and implement global policies, to develop and test tools and practical guidance documents, and to leverage partner funding and their expertise. The webinar today will provide you with an introduction to USAID's MAST approach, which is a community-based approach that is aimed at helping communities securing their land rights. With the recognition that documenting land and resources rights is key to achieving development objectives, USAID tested the feasibility of using a combination of participatory approaches and innovative technology methods to help communities clarify and document land rights. The approach was first tested in Tanzania, and it provides a set of principles to support development priorities, to improve the local capacity, and help disadvantaged populations, especially women, securing their rights to land and resources, which in turn empowers them to reach sustainable economic benefits and long-term prosperity. And you will hear about MAST case studies, principles, results, and the approach from our main webinar speaker, Jeffrey Euwema, who is the Chief of Party for the Land Technology Solutions Program.
Back to Jeff.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Euwema. I'm happy to be here today to share with you some of the findings of MAST implementations. To give you a little bit of a background about myself, I'm a trained geographer and I have about 20 years of experience working in land administration and management, 4 of which have been working with USAID, Land and Urban on the development and implementation of MAST. So I'm very excited to share some of our learnings with you, and towards the end, answer any questions that you may have. Today I'm going to talk to you about the background and challenges encountered during MAST implementations to give you a contextual understanding of how these implementations were initiated. And then I'm going to talk to you about outcomes and results, and then principles in the implementation approach. At the end, as I indicated, we'll have questions and answers. We'll also ask for reflection and feedback from the participants today's webinar. So the next couple slides will tell you about the context of MAST projects, how they were initiated, and we'll be focusing on 3 implementations today: Tanzania, Burkina Faso, and Liberia, where MAST is currently being implemented. In Tanzania, MAST investigations found that there was a need for new approaches to document land rights and build a reliable inventory of land. So MAST ended up seeking a way to integrate into an initiative to facilitate rural adjudication in Iringa district in Tanzania. We found that in Tanzania, government had made big commitments regarding mapping of lands, and as a result, there were increasing pressures on rural lands. The really big issues emerging from our assessment really was that through the government promotion, one could understand it, that large investments have aggregate impact on economic development for the government. So investments for large agricultural concerns was a big push. But in the rural communities, many of these communities were being displaced, and as a result, there were a growing number of disputes and conflicts emerging. So we found there was really a big need for a socially responsible approach to map lands, and MAST met the criteria. 1, it provided innovative technologies, which we were testing and hoped to achieve efficiencies, and also the approach was socially responsible and participatory. So a key aspect of MAST's success in Tanzania was really participatory approach. But what do we mean by participatory? Well, we found that in the rural adjudication programs in Tanzania, as well as the land use approaches, they were quote-unquote defined as participatory, but the implementation of these programs were really not participatory. We looked to balance the need for efficiency of mapping, but at the same time, a need for building inclusivity and participation into the program design. And so in the MAST design, we focused on engaging citizens in project processes. From the get-go, we built a collaborative approach with government and our partners. Our implementing partner in Tanzania for the pilots was CARE International. And we focused on developing a hyper-local and inclusive approach that went further than the traditional community-level workshops. So we were not really interested in a box-ticking exercise in Tanzania where we held a community workshop, 3 people showed up, and then we can proceed with implementation. We were really concerned with building advocacy and understanding and participation, and particularly focused on women and youth participation in the program. So we ended up designing a program that focused on streamlining customary land certification in Tanzania. In Burkina, we were building on the successes of Tanzania. We had implemented MAST in Tanzania and had some successes to report. But Burkina presented a totally different set of challenges. Government in Burkina didn't make big proclamations, but they were facing challenges related to conflicts. Conflicts were emerging over lands and resources, scarcity of resources in some areas, in-migration, conflict between farmers and pastoralists. And what we also found is that government was looking for a standardized approach. There was limited implementation of and successes of rural adjudication processes. And there was, as a result, there was really no standardized method or proven method for adjudicating lands. It was kind of piecemeal. So we looked at using MAST in Burkina to implement a rural land certification process in a rural commune. And the commune chosen in Burkina was Boudry. So, as I mentioned, MAST sought to address standardization, which required really a careful review of the laws and decrees, and really looking at the technical, legal, institutional, spatial requirements for adjudication or mapping lands for certification. We also looked at, around standardization, the realities of limited capacity of a decentralized land governance framework. So we looked at ways in which we could build capacity of stakeholders and beneficiaries. And so MAST really in Burkina had to adapt to a rigid kind of legal and technical framework, and at the same time present a technology and approach that was transparent, easy to follow, and stable enough so government would be supportive. That's getting back to the collaborative effort. And to achieve this, we worked really closely with implementing partner there, the Observatory National des Frontières, the ONF of Burkina Faso. And the collaboration with a strong partner was really key because they built a good and strong link with the government. And so it was really quite a collaborative approach with the ONF and the government of Burkina Faso. Through this partner and collaborative approach, we engaged stakeholders to look at ways to adapt the MAST technology to the legal framework. We looked at adapting approaches to the decentralized institutional framework, and that in Burkina involved multi-agencies. It involved the regional cadastre for review of lands that were mapped and adjudicated, as well as working with the commune level SFR, which is the kind of land authority at the commune level, and then drilling down at the local level with the CFVs, which were the persons in charge of overseeing the processes at the local level. So there's kind of a multi-tiered approach, and this resulted in kind of a standardized approach to adjudicating lands that was participatory, inclusive, and transparent. In Liberia, some key differences there. MAST is being adapted for a completely different use case, not land certification. It's actually being adapted to community forestry. And MAST assessment found that in Liberia there was a legal framework set up in 2009 that formalized forest resource rights. The CRL of 2009, Community Rights Law of 2009. But we found that the institutions that were designated to implement and support the mandates of the law were quite constrained. Constrained in human resources, financial resources, and also constrained by the logistics of traveling through Liberia. At the community level, the law set up governance bodies to manage the community forest, and we found that there was key constraints within the governance bodies as well. And when we drilled down to the community level, we found that the community level, the communities really did not have an understanding of their lands and resources inside the forest as well as outside of the forest. These presented some challenges on how to adapt MAST to Liberia. So in Liberia, again, we worked closely with a local implementing partner, FIFES, a USAID project, Forest Incomes for Environmental Sustainability. And we worked with them to engage stakeholders and beneficiaries at multiple levels, at the national level, at the district level, and then at the community forest and community level. We also worked to engage practitioners that were involved in forestry and land to kind of understand the weaknesses of laws and some of the institutional constraints. And then that really helped us identify opportunities to utilize MAST in a creative manner to increase the community's understandings of their land and resource base. So MAST, what MAST is doing in Liberia is really seeking to develop an integrated demonstration project to test whether the technology and approach can be used effectively to help communities understand resources inside and out of the community forest. And in Liberia, we're working in the Belay Community Forest in Nimba, and that is a part of the country that's surrounded by Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire. And the communities, we're working with 7 communities that immediately surround the community forest conservation area. And we're working with these communities to engage and empower citizens in understanding the laws, understanding their rights, as well as mapping community boundaries and seeking to forge a new framework for management of forest lands and lands that are in the wider landscape. So those are kind of the challenges and set the tone for going into some of the immediate results that we're seeing. I want to also emphasize that if participants have questions, please ask them in the chat, and my colleagues will grab the questions out and can be fielded during the presentation as well as after. So I'll jump into results. I just wanted to emphasize that point. These implementations in Tanzania, Burkina, and Liberia really, in Tanzania, resulted in scaling and adoption of the MAST technology and approach by government stakeholders. In Burkina, It's resulted in a project that's being scaled along the Mali border. And in Liberia, it's ongoing, but some key lessons are emerging from the participatory approach. And so I'll go over some of these results in more detail. In Tanzania, MAST has had really big impacts. Right after the pilot and building on the successive pilots, MAST was used in a USAID project. It's resulted in over 63,000 parcels being mapped. MAST has also been adopted by the government of Tanzania in some of their rural adjudication projects, and that has resulted in over 200,000 parcels being mapped. We've also seen some really strong results, not only in the pilot, but in the USAID program, of 50% of the beneficiaries that have received land certificates, CCROs, have been women. And MAST has also resulted in a huge cost reduction for adjudicating lands. And that started under the pilot, but has really taken off as the USAID project has brought the technology to scale and has worked to implement some new features that allow mass updates, signatures, and have worked with the government on reducing some of the costs. So we've seen the cost for parcel drop from about 40 before the pilot to about 27 during the pilot, and now down to $8 US dollars per parcel. So that's some big impacts there. In Burkina Faso, we've had big impacts through the pilot initiative. As I indicated earlier, it's now getting ready to be scaled. But some of the big impacts that we achieved was we actually mapped 2,600 parcels that were mapped and prepared for adjudication. And in Burkina, this number that was achieved in 6 months' time, and mind you, during that 6-month window, 1 month was just for notification. It represents more parcels that had been mapped in the entire country in the previous 4 years. So it's been quite impactful. The occupancy division is primarily male, but there are female participants and beneficiaries. And the community approach has been supported by the government. The technology has been standardized, and the transparency and inclusivity of the process has been supported. And USAID is getting ready to support the scaling along the Mali border for land certification in some of those areas that are experiencing conflict with resources and between farmers and pastoralists. Oops. In Liberia, as indicated, we're seeking to introduce a new model for community forestry programming. And we feel that it provides opportunities not only for USAID's programming as a rethink of where their program's going, but also for the government to look at interagency collaboration between the Forest Development Authority and the newly developed Liberian Land Authority. We also are seeking to extend the focus of the community forest beyond the conservation area to the wider landscape to really promote the interplay between forest and landscape. And we are using MAST to engage communities not only in the mapping of their lands to protect biodiversity, but improving forest and land management by introducing sustainable land uses in the communities. And some of the lessons that we've seen emerge are a better understanding of the need for interagency coordination, as I indicated, between the FDA and LLA, better communications within local governance groups, and we're finding out that MAST is a powerful tool for visualization purposes and can be useful for conflict resolution and harmonization purposes, where when Liberia looks to implement the newly enacted LRA. So we've seen some demonstrative benefits coming out of the implementation now, and hope to have that project wrapped up in the next couple months. So I'm going to talk about principles, but I wanted to ask, and I see there's one question. Yes, the question is related to Liberia. Is there an opportunity for community rights documented through MAST to be formalized under the Land Rights Act? And how are these rights currently being stored? Well, I think there is a tremendous opportunity. It's not part of the pilot per se to look at documenting and formalizing the rights, but we are mapping community boundaries, and we are working with communities to understand areas where there's conflicts. And so there is a tremendous opportunity, and as I alluded to in the previous slide, we have seen that by having the citizens map their boundaries and understand where some of the conflicts exist and helping them visualize it through maps and spatial data, this could be very beneficial for the harmonization process that's defined in the guidelines of the new LRA. And so that's key. Right now, the storage of land rights, the MAST tool allows the data to be stored and housed either in a cloud server or a standalone server, but we're not there to address that per se. Another question related to okay, let's see, there was one about Tanzania that just jumped off. In addition, how information on land rights being stored, how are changes in rights, if any, via transfers, inheritance, and donations being tracked? In Liberia, we're not looking at subsequent registration, but in Burkina Faso, we are, and we've helped integrate a new module for subsequent registration in Burkina, because one of the issues related to the need for standardized approach and a standardized technology frame is that the government in Burkina does not have a national system, and they realize that they want to proceed with the adjudication of rural lands, but they needed a platform to do so. And so MAST is kind of filling that void as they proceed with looking on how they're going to develop a national system. And so within the MAST technology frame, there is a registration module that allows for the management or the administration of subsequent registration transfers, sales, leases. Actually, leases are the most prevalent type of activity. So MAST has that module. Related to the cost, okay, the data long term, it varies between projects. Right now in Tanzania, as MAST is being scaled, Tanzania has just implemented a national land system and ILMIS at the Ministry of Lands. And so I think they've gone through the kind of the final steps of the first phase. And during that first phase, there was discussion on how to bring in the data that's being collected by MAST at the USAID project and also the ministry level into the national system. USAID is using a cloud-based approach and also storing data at the district land office. And the government is actually using servers at multiple levels and storing the data. In Burkina, I just alluded to that the data is being stored in MAST itself and managed by the ONF and government. And then in Liberia, we're in discussions with the FDA or LLA on which stakeholder would take over the management of the infrastructure. Question related. Hello?
Yes, Jeff. There is a question about arbitration and conflict resolution that Euwema will answer. So we can answer that question now, and then we can go through the other questions that you are trying to answer.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So the okay.
So I could read the question if that's helpful.
Yeah. No, I got it. What is the MAST approach to arbitration and conflict resolution? MAST uses a participatory approach. We engage citizens. We help citizens. Yes, hello?
Sorry, just wanted to give a little bit of the context, and then you can add. This is Euwema.
Okay.
So the idea with the MAST approach is, and I would call this disputes rather than conflict resolution. I don't think we really have a good case study where we can reference conflict resolution. But in terms of disputes, I think one of the important findings with the implementation of the MAST approach was that the disputes number is fairly low after going to consultations, adjudication, and validation of the boundaries. Actually, the number of disputes is quite low, and that seems to be pretty consistent, especially in Tanzania, where we have seen a lot of the data regarding disputes. So that is related to the fact that through the MAST approach, there's a lot of time spent in consultations, in participation with communities to make sure that the data is validated. And that also leads to relatively quick resolution of the smaller disputes, let's say family disputes, neighbor disputes. So that's definitely one of the main findings so far. I don't think we can really talk about conflict resolution at this point, but because of the, I think, transparency of the approach and the continuous participation of the communities in the process speaks to the low number of disputes in general.
Yes, and I would add to that is that we really seek to work within the existing culturally appropriate resolution practices. So it's really up to the citizens and the leaders at the village level to see whether disputes can be resolved locally to facilitate the mapping process. And if there are big disputes, those disputes are elevated through the mechanisms that are in place through the legal framework. Okay. Should I continue answering questions or save some of them till the end?
I think we can save some of them to the end, and we are storing the questions in the box that says questions in your private chat, so that at the end you can look at that and we will have only the ones that haven't been responded.
Okay, great. Okay, super. I see some questions about GitHub and land use and strategies. So I will proceed, and I'll get to the question about cost and some of the technical questions as well. Okay, so getting back into the presentation, through the implementation and results, we see some common themes emerging. As you see in the next couple slides, these themes have guided our principles, and they've guided our implementation approach. And not to say that the implementation approach is rigid, it's very flexible and adaptable. We just emphasize some key themes. And so common themes emerging here really are adaptability to context. MAST can be adapted to a variety of different contexts. Tanzania was related to rule adjudication laws and working within the legal framework. In Burkina, it was quite rigid, word for word, based on decrees and laws. And in Liberia, a completely different use case around community forestry. Collaboration, really key here, is that USAID really seeks to build on collaborative approaches, and we're not disruptive, and we really seek to build buy-in at all levels, at the national level, regional level, local level. And it's not only to facilitate the process, but also to encourage participation at all of those levels. Rigorous stakeholder engagement, very important. Throughout the different steps, always engaging different stakeholders, practitioners that are working in land, at the regional level, those who have worked in the areas that you've worked in, etc. And empowerment and participation, building participation, building inclusivity, and seeking ways to build capacity through doing, as opposed to kind of standardized training. And this next slide outlines key principles. The slide kind of speaks for itself, but these are the guiding principles to really keep in mind when looking at developing a program around innovative technologies. And so we align with partners and stakeholders, and that's really important for understanding the context, the frameworks, legal, technical, spatial. It's important for design. Ensure inclusivity, encourage ownership through participation at all levels, build capacity, again, building capacity by doing, building self-reliance, skill development, strategically and purposely targeting vulnerable groups, women, youth in particular. And then establish and communicate efficient workflows, not only for the implementation of the project to define roles, but also important to think about the back end of the project on communicating results and the processes that would help build buy-in through dissemination of lessons learned, successes. And so when you look at these guiding principles in kind of an implementation framework, the MAST approach, during the assessment, when you start, you identify the needs and opportunities, but really you're focused on understanding the context, you're focused on aligning with national priorities, you're focused on adding value to the development programs in your country. If it's specific to USAID, looking at opportunities that add value to portfolios, link with other programs addressing cross-sectoral sector problems, and then you get into designing a program. So you develop a high-level project framework. That framework is based on partnerships that are forged during the assessment phase. You seek to build trust within national partners as well as local partners during the design. And then prior to execution of the activities, and really sensitization could be considered a execution activity in itself, but we seek to build capacities and understanding, and building advocacy of laws, policies, and regulations, understanding of rights, promoting the importance of participation and inclusivity at the community level is also really important, and in some ways can be enlightening to leadership on the importance of including women and youth in project processes. And then execution. Defining efficient processes, defining roles, but engaging citizens in the process, but not only saying, go out and map your land, but helping them contextualize the reasons for mapping the land, how to interact with their fellow citizens on if a farmer would have questions about why they're mapping lands, helping them to figure out how it contextualizes, helps their community. Then self-reliance, as I indicated before, really strengthening capacities, more than one-off training, helping to build how project fits within other development initiatives, and emphasizing the importance of land and land rights as a basis for economic development. And then finally, formalizing the project by providing documentation. But documentation is not only important to produce a nice report at the end of the project. Really, one of the key elements of MAST is having a sound monitoring and evaluation program built in. And so making sure that there are right resources in place to collect data, monitor progress, and also, if need be, based on the data that's coming back, adapt the program a bit to emphasize different things. In Liberia, we just did that to emphasize that we were focusing on resources and not on land rights documentation, soliciting more feedback from the community. And then documentation is also very important to promote achievements to build momentum within the country that you're working in. And so looking at avenues within important stakeholder groupings, whether it's the ministry, whether it's an NGO forum, whether it's through donor groupings. So really building that momentum to share lessons learned, data findings, understanding of the technology, and these through USAID are available on the MAST learning platform, where there's a plethora of information about MAST. And so that concludes my presentation, and I'll jump into some questions, and I encourage you to ask more questions. And let me see, I have 8 questions in here.
Yeah.
Yes, hello, Patricia.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Before we jump into the questions, we would like to hear, and we will just put a chat box in front of your screens. We would like to hear from you. What are the challenges that you have encountered in your own countries of projects? We heard the ones that Jeff talked and the ones that MAST has addressed, but we are curious about the ones you are encountering. And so we can spend 1 or 2 minutes, if you can write on the chat about your challenges, and then we will move to the Q&A in the order that we have the questions that Jeff will start answering the questions. Some of you are typing, thank you very much. So we will leave the chat open as we start answering the questions. As we go through it, we will appreciate your answers in terms of what are the challenges that you face in your own countries. It will help us as we continue working on MAST and exploring different opportunities for MAST. So we really appreciate your answers. And as you type, we can start answering the questions. So Jeff, if you want to start answering with the questions, we will leave the chat with the challenges for people to type.
Okay, great. Yeah, so the first question about transfers, I think I've answered that already. We have a module that we've built on the MAST technology platform to facilitate subsequent registrations. Also, the USAID project in Tanzania has also built a module there as well to facilitate that. And so, and that's working within the kind of framework, legal framework in both countries. In Tanzania, the cost was reduced from $40 to $8 or $7.85. I do not have the specific costs that were cut, but I can tell you from my experience there, when I was looking at it, one of the big costs was related to the use of crested paper, and certificates have to be printed in triplicate. So that was a huge cost, and I think contributed almost $8 right out of the gate. So slashing that was huge. I think also some of the costs were related to inclusion of a digital signature for the authorized land representative at the district level. That meant that he was able to function within his workday and didn't need extra time and per diem to facilitate that. So that was a huge cost. And I think some efficiencies were also implemented during the scaling process through the use of districting and processes that linked nodes within the technology to reduce the cost of data cleaning. So I don't have an itemized list, but those are some of the areas where costs were cut. Simon, the latest version on GitHub, yes, we have updated that code base, and that code base should be updated as of like March 2019. Really, MAST is built on a variety of technology tools, but the main skills needed are Java development to change configuration on the DMI as well, and in the mobile application using Android standard Android development tools. So I encourage you to go to GitHub. The latest version has been updated, and we know that the documentation, we've also updated the documentation, which has facilitated recreation of the code by some third parties recently. So please let us know, though, if you have any questions and issues related to recreation. We'll be happy to facilitate your work with MAST technology frame. Michael Brown, who makes land use planning decisions once data is generated? Good question. I mean, in Tanzania, we did not look at land use, while the USAID scale project, LTA project, is looking at land use. That's being done at the community level. In Burkina Faso, for the scaling, we've introduced a resource mapping module that allows the mapping of different land uses, existing land uses such as forest, agricultural land, rivers, etc. And in Liberia, specifically, we are not promoting land use, but we're doing some overlay analysis to help them quantify their resources in terms of the existing footprint of how much land is in forest, in the wider landscape, that is, outside of the conservation area. How much land is in forest, how much land is in agriculture, how much land is settlement, and then helping make decisions whether there should be increases to the allocation of settlement land, or do you feel that there's enough land for continued slash and burn agriculture in your community, so to drive kind of into some sustainable uses. Again, Liberia strategy work under CARPE and IRM. No, I'm not familiar with this work, but I'm happy to share a link with you so that we could communicate directly about this. We've worked with a few groups there, and our focus is at the community forest level.
Jeff,
so
can I add something? This is Euwema. Just on that question, I think to have a more general answer, not necessarily specific to Liberia, regarding the MAST approach and how it was informed by participatory mapping that was tested, including through CARPE and many other programs before. Definitely the participatory mapping methods incorporate a lot of the lessons learned, including through the CARPET program. So that's the objectives were a bit different because under CARPET there was a focus specifically for the participatory mapping that was tested there. There was a focus on the local forest resources management, and that's relevant for Liberia. But the methods were definitely, and lessons learned were definitely incorporated into the participatory mapping approach as part of MAST. So it's a more general answer, not necessarily specific to Liberia. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks for the clarification. Yeah. Question, have the technical services of the host governments and communities appropriated this technology to ensure sustainability after the end of the project? Tanzania, definitely yes. I think Burkina, it's on its way in terms of the work with the ONF and the government and looking at MAST to fill that void for a period of 5 years. In Liberia, we're working on seeing whether MAST will be adopted by the FDA or the land authority. Our primary focus has been in community forest. So we are focused on working with the FDA for adapting MAST. Justine, considering the digital gender divide and other gender dimensions, can you speak to any challenge you face engaging women benefiting from MAST-based employment, access to information, capacity development? This is a very good question. We in our trainings, in our community workshops, and even the hyperlocal activities, we focus on engaging women. What we found in Tanzania is that through the hyperlocal and hamlet level discussions, it was a more intimate discussion, so women came forward and discussed a lot of their concerns and needs related to land and being dispossessed from land. So the engagement there in Liberia, we're giving specific groups an opportunity to voice their opinion. So whether it's youth or women that are participating in our community activities, they're having a voice. The training, the technical training of mapping, we have seen a bias where young men are better positioned to use the technology, and what we've done is tried to the trainings have identified the best users of the technology, but what we've tried to do is as a larger group is downsized, we seek to keep a few women involved in the process and give them extra training so that they can actually participate and be engaged in the activities. So that's how we've done that. It's been a key focus there. Another question, Michael Brown. Who makes land use planning decisions once data is generated? What we've seen in the community forest is that we've worked with the governance body, the CFMB and the CAs, but we've also, as I alluded to in the conversation, we've seen that the communication of some of the decisions that are made within the government body are not trickling down to the communities. So we've engaged the communities around forest uses and inventorying of their lands. So we're promoting that the communities themselves actually have a voice and have promoted that within the governance body, the CFMB and CA. We've supported the CFMB as kind of the management body, but we've tried to cultivate the voice around land and resource decisions at the community level. In your Liberia strategy, did you refer to Carpe? I think we've answered that. Euwema answered that. We did reach out to groups that are involved with the LLA on developing guidance and some of the best practices. The other question is related to decisions about who owns the data. Right now in Liberia, I think your question is Liberia specific. Right now, Liberia, the data that we're generating is being housed by the project itself. And again, we're looking to work with the FDA to take that over. And then we will present the data in a form, so coordinates for boundary points, pictures in paper form, so the communities will actually own the data. So it's yet to be defined on the Liberia side. Question about Burkina Faso. Currently, the pilot was implemented in Boudry commune, but there are about 8 or 9 communes along the Mali border. I don't have all of their names, but one of them I know specifically as Baroum. And so the people that would be engaged in the MAST activity there would be directly the regional cadastre, the SFRs that are in the 8 or 9 communes on the Mali border, as well as the CFVs at the community level to help facilitate the implementation. And the direct beneficiaries are the farmers that are occupying the land. And the end game there would be the issuance of an APFR, the land certificate in Burkina. Mike, I've experimented with the approach in the 90s using Palm Pilot and GPS in South Africa. Community was engaged. NGO managed land reform project was not. And when they had a change in personnel, all the data was lost. This happens a lot where a lot of the project data is siloed, and this is getting back to the collaborative approach of really trying to build momentum within the government so that there's ownership of the process and ownership of the data after the project is left. So you have to address data issues and sensitivities up front. Kathleen, can you speak specifically on how your team engaged women farmers to reduce potential for marital or community disruption? Yes, in Tanzania, it's probably the greatest example. In Liberia, we did it as well in terms of some of the baseline surveys that separated women. But in Tanzania, when we did the hyperlocal or hamlet level community outreach and sensitization, we really focused on having women talk and express their concerns. And many women, when they were in a group with other women specifically, were very vocal about the potential for losing land, being dispossessed through either divorce or death. And so these findings, we explained these findings to the community leadership and stressed the importance of mapping women's lands and having women as the sole beneficiary of the certificate. So we've tried to give a forum for women, and then also work with leadership so that they could understand the importance of engaging women. Simon, you mentioned the need for to be sensitive to a different country context, and that the core of MAST remains static. Have you sure that this core is applicable to all contexts, and how do you allow context specificity to be added? Well, the core, there's two things really at play here, is that there's a prototypical kind of implementation approach that we're proposing with MAST, and then the technology itself is built on kind of a standard land administration domain model. So there is, there is a meeting of some of the base requirements that you would have for land adjudication globally. However, it does not mean that MAST is an out-of-the-box tool that can be applied to all contexts. It involves really assessing the requirements that are needed, and then making the technology changes to adapt the technology to the specific context. So you're simultaneously looking at mapping the technology and approach to a specific context as part of MAST.
So thank you, everyone. We have answered all the questions that we were able to track on the chat, and we really appreciate your participation. We also will love your feedback. And so in the screen, you very soon will see some questions that we will appreciate if you answer. The USAID Land and Urban Office will continue offering webinars, and that feedback is important for us. And again, thank you for participating. You will receive a thank you email with the link to the recording of the webinar as well. So you see now in the screen our polls to receive feedback. What will you do next with MAST? This webinar improved my understanding of the topic, and you have some choices. This webinar has motivated me to learn more about MAST, and you have some choices. And one thing I like about this webinar was, and you can write it and type it, and then one recommendation for future webinars that we organize is. Again, thank you, and your feedback is strongly appreciated.